I should perhaps say at the outset of this talk that I'm going to distinguish between two categories of women in humanism. First, there are those among our female members who have contributed more or less internally to the affairs of BCHA. A few names which come to mind are Holly Ashley, our very first treasurer, and then Kathy Levins and Heather MacDonald, our two most recent treasurers. They wouldn't seem to like to be close to the money. Eileen Manning was our first social convener. Nancy Duncan, who's with us today, she was the originator of the Sunday breakfast. Dr. Annette Horton is here. She's a past president. Crystal Catadell, I think she's here. So there are many women who are contributing day to day and week by week. But secondly, there are those among our female members who have contributed to the humanist cause external to BCHA by demonstrating what we preach to the larger general public through exemplary lives which they have led. It is about three of these women that I wish to speak today. Society at large is as indebted to them as we are in our narrow context. You may remember this quotation from Shakespeare, from the Friends, Romans, Countrymen. The evil that men do is after the good is often interred with their bones. And so although these are not men we're talking about women, I feel it's appropriate to remember that we stand on the shoulders of these people who went before. And so from time to time I think we should just remember their contributions. The first lady I'd like to talk about briefly is Amy Dalgleish. When I started to research the material for this presentation, I went onto the internet and found, among other things, there were papers and memos about Amy Dalgleish on file in the rare books and special collections of a division of the UBC library. So when I went out to the library to have a look at what was available, I was astonished to find that the filing boxes containing her data occupied no less than 1.7 meters of shelf space. And when you get these boxes, they weigh them before they give them to you. And when you return them, they weigh them again to be sure you haven't pinched anything, I guess. And the records were donated by her daughter Judith in 1998. One aspect of the research was that there are extremely few photographs of Amy in the collection. And in fact, this was the only photograph in that 1.75 meters of shelf space that I could find. And it was taken from a newsletter put out by the NDP. And so that's why the photograph is, first of all, black and white, and secondly, of poor quality. Not because of the NDP, by the way. It's just that it was difficult to reproduce it. Amy was born in Scotland in September 20, 1905, and at an early age emigrated to Ontario and later to Alberta with her parents. After graduating high school, she settled in Vancouver, where she met and married Frank Copperthorne around 1954. They had two children, a son named Robert and a daughter, Judith. Initially after marriage, Amy used her maiden name. All went well until her mother died in 1955. In the process of settling that estate, Amy was required to sign a form to have her mother's will probated. The registrar would not accept her maiden name on the form. There then ensued a lengthy court case which spread over about 9 months. She was able to convince the judge that she was indeed well known as Amy Dalgleish in her community, having acquired and maintained her name not only by birth documentation, but more importantly, by reputation. The final outcome was that this case caused the law in British Columbia to be changed to permit females to keep their maiden names if they so wish. Incidentally, males can now adopt their wives' names if they should so choose. Now there is a precedent, by the way. A woman with the name of Lucy Stone, who lived in Massachusetts in 1855, did exactly the same thing. She wanted to keep her maiden name and managed to get the laws in Massachusetts changed at that time. Shortly after this, and while their children were still dependents, her husband Frank died, leaving Amy as a single parent who had to go to work to support her family. She became employed in a variety of positions, Among her paid occupations, she was employed by the Royal Bank of Canada as a teller, by the New Democratic Party as a treasurer, and she was a director at the Marginal Market Food Co-op in Vancouver. On political issues, although a long-time Cooperative Commonwealth Federation supporter, Amy eventually joined the New Democratic Party and indeed ran as a provincial NDP candidate, although without success. She was also involved with the rights of Indigenous Aboriginal groups, various campaigns to save the CBC, provision of daycare services, dying with dignity, the environment and recycling, family law, midwifery, forestry, peace groups. I wonder where these people find time to actually go earn a living and go about their business. She also withheld a percentage of her income tax one year equal to the proportion she estimated was being spent on the Canadian military. I think we could all maybe borrow from that example. Understandably, she lost that particular fight. In social issues, in addition to her political activities, she was involved with a large number of social groups. Some of these included the Broadway Commonwealth Society, a group called InFact, which is a breastfeeding advocacy group of which she was president. Don't forget, this was all about 20, 30 odd years ago. So she was a leader in the field there. Conscience Canada, the Council of Canadians, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Vancouver Society of Friends for the Elderly. Where is she now? And women's issues in general. She also made 3 expense-paid trips overseas as a volunteer on behalf of various social welfare groups, one to China, one to Nicaragua, and one to the Philippines in 1989. Details of all of these trips, of course, you can find in the archive boxes. Now, philosophically, Amy was an agnostic humanist in outlook and practice. She was a member of BCHA for several years in the 1980s, and although she did not actually serve on the board, she was very active in the affairs of the group, keen participant. To mention just one example of an initiative, the directors discovered they had a substantial amount of money as a result of hosting a casino night, and they asked the members for suggestions on how to spend the money. Amy immediately proposed buying a shelf full of books on humanism and free thought and donating them to the public library. And that was done, and these books are still on the library shelves. There were about 20 or 30 of them. One of the file boxes in the UBC archives contains papers of her interest in theology in general and humanism in particular. And so after a long and productive and useful life, Amy died in Vancouver in 1992 at age 87. And just by way to conclude, there was a mention of her in Hansard. For those of you who don't know, Hansard is the written record of the parliamentary proceedings, both federally and provincially. And this is from the BC Legislature's Hansard. John McPhail, I asked the House to join me in acknowledging, celebrating the life of many achievements of a wonderful British Columbian just recently passed away. Amy Dalgleish, at the age of 86, died last Thursday. Her activism and involvement stretched over many decades, first through the CCF, the Saskatchewan Council of Women, the United Nations Association, and the Unitarian Church. In later years, she ran for the New Democratic Party. She acted as our provincial treasurer. She got involved in the movement against the Vietnam War, started a support group for the elderly, and worked to open abortion clinics in British Columbia. So Amy left her mark in British Columbia, and I think we're all indebted to her for that. There should be a roll of drums, I think, for the next person, at least a thunderclap. Now, with respect to Claire Culhane, it should be kept in mind that the story of Claire occurred against a backdrop composed of, first of all, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Second World War in the 1940s, the Cold War in the 1950s, the McCarthy era in the 1960s, the Vietnam War and the FLQ crisis in the 1970s, and prison riots in Canada in the 1980s. As well, the conversion of Canada from a largely agricultural country to a major industrial force occurred over this same period. In all of this, Claire Culhane was not just an onlooker, but an active and outspoken participant in many of the secondary activities flowing from these great events and eras. This severely edited summary merely represents some highlights, just a few of these activities. Now, most of the information I'm going to give you came from a book by Mick Lowe entitled One Woman Army, a very apt title for the book. Also in the Special Collections Division, UBC, the Culhane records, the list alone runs to 100 pages, and the material numbers in the tens of thousands of pages. So it was a major task to go through all of that. Needless to say, I didn't do it. I just took a small summary from the end. Early life, she was the daughter of Rose and Abraham Eglin, themselves Russian Jewish refugees. Claire was born in 1918 in Montreal. She had an older brother, Jack. The family fortunes, though never great, generally improved over time, lessening the social pressures and enabling them to assimilate more readily into society. Her early secular education occurred in English language Protestant schools. She proved to be an apt student with an interest in politics and social issues, especially in women's rights. One of her heroes was Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette. Despite obstacles, she graduated from high school, learned how to drive, and trained as a nurse with a special interest in ethics. However, due to a clash with her superiors, she did not complete her training. In the mid-1930s, she took a short business course and got a job in a family garment company. She later found fairly consistent employment by specializing in systems of medical records, which were not widespread use at that time, and earned additional income by typing reports and theses for cash. Her religious education started at age 6, when she was physically beaten for attempting to kiss the Torah in a synagogue, despite having seen her brother and other male members of the family do just that. That education continued as she dealt with severe anti-Semitic discrimination at almost every point in her life. Once, when asked about religion, she replied, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Later, when she was asked about her racial origin, she said her mother came from Kiev and her father came from Vilna. The interrogator recorded her as being Irish. Reminds me a bit of Bertrand Russell being buried in a cemetery in Peking Reserve for Gods. In their labour union period, Claire's experiences with conditions in the Quebec garment industry triggered her first interest in improving the lot of the ordinary person. She worked for the anti-fascist movement in Quebec during the Spanish Civil War of 36 to 39. Claire joined the Friends of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, supporters of the Republican cause, intending to go to Spain to act as a nurse or as an ambulance driver. However, a new law prevented Canadian citizens from engaging in foreign wars. Not sure just how strongly that law was applied, because I think there were a lot of Canadians spent time in foreign wars. Near the end of the Depression, the Eglin family lost their business and moved to California. Claire went with them, and after finding work in a medical laboratory, she became involved with the Los Angeles branch of the Communist Party. But not for long. She returned to Montreal in 1938, picking up where she had left off in her commitment to social issues. However, she began to disengage from Communist Party influences. Claire found work as an organizer for the Office Workers Union and the Retail Clerks Union. It was through this latter group that she met Gary Culhane, a man with a significant Irish political pedigree, but who was also then married to a woman he said he no longer loved. In 1940, Claire and Gary came under the scrutiny of the RCMP in a file which was to expand to several hundred pages over the next 50 years. One wonders how many of the rest of us have files on file with the RCMP. When she finally risked introducing Gary to her parents, the meeting was a complete disaster. opening family wounds which lasted for a lifetime. In 1941, Gary and Claire moved to the West Coast, where Claire found work as a bookkeeper with the Sauder Lumber Company in Falls Creek. Just about near where I live now, just by the way. In 1942, they moved to Victoria when Gary got a job at Yarra Shipyards. For most of the World War II period, Claire and Gary were involved in the labour and trade union movement. However, conscription was introduced in Canada, and every able-bodied male had to register. If Gary had done so, he would have been arrested, so Claire got a temporary job at one of the registration booths and managed to make it appear as though Gary had in fact registered. She actually just removed the papers that said that he hadn't registered. The risks in doing this were enormous. The penalty of 10 years in jail for tampering with federal government documents. Shortly after this, Claire discovered she was pregnant, and given their straitened circumstance, elected to have an abortion, a process which was then as risky as it was illegal. Luckily, it was successful. But they still could not get married because of Quebec's strict divorce laws until Gary's wife became involved with another man, thus opening the way for legal separation and subsequent divorce. In the midst of all of this, Claire found that she was pregnant again, and again sought an abortion in a very negatively charged social, family, and political atmosphere. You have to admire the courage of that woman to contemplate these things and to go through with them at that time. Gary's fortunes continued to improve, and in 1944 they moved back to Vancouver, where Claire became involved in union activities and various social issues, but still under the scrutiny of the RCMP. In 1945, she was pregnant again, and this time fought successfully to keep the baby, a girl born in 1946 named Sandra Roisin, and who was partly instrumental in reconciling Claire with her parents in California. She took the baby to California to show to the parents, and they kind of softened their resistance to her husband. She finally married Gary Culhane in the fall of 1948, but it was not a happy union. The family was chronically short of money. They both became disillusioned with the Communist Party and quit around 1950. To add to these problems, Claire found she was pregnant again, giving birth to a second daughter named Hannah Dara. In 1958, they decided to try their fortunes in commercial fishing and boat rentals in Cork in Southern Ireland. The business was not successful, and Claire and one daughter, Dara, moved first to Dublin and then back to Montreal. Gary and the other daughter stayed on in Ireland, and the other daughter became a Catholic because she discovered that most of her friends in Ireland were Catholic, and she liked the family life, the Catholic family life, so she decided to become a Catholic. Claire and Gary apparently divorced, but I could not confirm that fact or date. For some reason or other, that was not in the record. In what I've called the political period there, after another 10 years in various positions promoting trade unionism, the anti-war cause, while working mostly in medical records jobs, around 1967, she applied to and was accepted by External Affairs to participate in the establishment of a tuberculosis hospital in Vietnam, as a consequence of which she was able to assess the situation firsthand, and in particular Canada's role in that war. It was a major turning point in her life. Quite apart from the glacial pace of bureaucracy when trying to get equipment and supplies, she also encountered firsthand the tragic human effects of indiscriminate bombings, shootings, and napalm strikes. She decided that she could resist the war more effectively at home, and so after about 6 months, she returned to Canada in 1968, where she proceeded to stir up the politicos in Ottawa for the next 5 years to bring an end to the war. In one episode, she chained herself to a chair in the House of Commons public gallery and challenged the members directly by throwing leaflets down on their heads. She was arrested, but the charge of disturbance was dismissed in court. She was 50 years old by this time, and in succeeding years, she was involved in confronting government ministers and bureaucrats, reporting on the My Lai massacre, speaking out against the FLQ crisis in Quebec, and establishing the Voice of Women in Canada. Now, the next period of her life involves the prisoners and justice. In 1974, Claire was back in Vancouver. You can see why she was called, the book was called The One Woman Army. This is all just one woman we're talking about. Back in Vancouver, she volunteered to teach a women's studies class at the Lakeside Regional Correctional Centre for Women. The following June, 3 prisoners who were about to be returned to solitary confinement in the BC Penitentiary took 15 hostages. The standoff with prison officials lasted for 41 hours and ended with the emergency response team storming the hostage takers. In the process, the guards shot and killed one of the hostages, Mary Steinhauser, a correctional officer who was implementing courses for prisoners. Some of you may recall that tragic event. Over the next month, Claire would join in demonstrations in support of prisoners who were staging sit-ins and work strikes over the conditions inside. Her participation in the Prisoners' Union Committee resulted in the cancellation of her women's studies class. A group of Vancouver area activists then set up the Prisoners' Rights Group. Claire was one of its founding members. The mandate of the Prisoners' Rights Group was to help prisoners to help themselves, especially in matters involving involuntary transfers, finding competent lawyers, following up on grievances, qualifying for parole or hearings, getting access to health care, educating the public, and finally, to advance the implementation of the philosophy of prison abolition. Something we still work on, I'm sure. In 1976, she joined the newly formed Citizens Advisory Committee. This group was formed by the Canadian Penitentiary Service, later the Correctional Services of Canada, in an attempt to better its public image. It seemed to be more concerned with the public image than conditions in the prisons. The CAC was in the process of establishing itself when the BC Pen again erupted in a full-scale riot. The CAC was called at the request of the prisoners to help negotiate an end to the riot. The prisoners had control of the prison for 3 days before an agreement with the CPS was reached. Claire was there all along. She spent 80 hours locked in with the inmates. The fear was that if the CAC left the prison, the military and the police stationed outside would move in and take the prison by force. All of Claire's life experiences had prepared her for this moment. She and the inmates stood their ground and were in the end mostly successful in their demands for adequate accommodations. Damage to the building amounted to $1.6 million, raising memories of Laval in Quebec and Attica in New York. You may recall there were revolutions in these prisons about the same time and for mostly the same reasons. Claire was twice charged with trespassing in the prisons and fined small sums. She refused to pay the small sums and was admonished and set free. So keep that in mind the next time you get a parking ticket. I'm not paying that. Set me free. As we now know, Claire was a woman of action. She was barred from many prisons. She staged many sit-ins at the warden's offices, picketed outside the gates and on Parliament Hill, hosted a cable TV show called Instead of Prisons, responded to every article about prison written by the press, wrote articles of her own, and spoke extensively on the subject of prisons as social control. Whenever a prisoner wrote the Prisoners' Rights Group with a concern, the response from Claire was immediate. Letters would fly up the chain of command to politicians in Ottawa and finally to the media if necessary. She was especially critical of the BC Penitentiary and in 1979 wrote a book titled Barred from Prison about the penitentiary. As Claire set off on a book tour to promote that particular book, her intention was to stop and visit as many prisoners as possible as wanted to see her, in as many prisons as would let her in. This was not the policy of prisons at the time. Visitors could only visit one prisoner in one prison in one region. She managed to visit every maximum security plus several of the lower security prisons outside BC. In 1987, her visiting privileges were reinstated. And in 1990, one of her final major public acts was to take sides with the Aboriginal at the OKA reservation in Ontario.
Oka.
Oka, sorry, Oka.
It's not initials, it's the name of the place.
It's the name of the, they're capitalized here. You're right, it's Oka.
They make cheese.
Cheese. Yes. And the pork,
Mountains there make
I
cheese.
believe they import cigarettes too, but that's all. Anyway, to conclude, despite these experiences, Claire still managed to find time for her daughters, her friends, and their families. I just have no idea how these people do that. I have no time for my family and my friends. They often complain about that too. After she died in April 1996, ex-prisoners, friends, and family set up a commemorative bench for her in John Henry Park at Trout Lake in Vancouver. If you wish to help maintain the bench, you can do so through the Vancouver Park Board. This is the Hansard for the Federal Parliament in Ottawa. Anna Tarana was the Liberal MP for Vancouver East at that time. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that Mrs. Claire Culhane of Vancouver East has been selected as one of the 23 recipients of the 1995 Canada Volunteer Medal Certificate of Honour. Mrs. Culhane is a respected and admired Canadian who is a competent fighter for justice. Some of her campaigns against injustice include anti-Franco activities in Spain in the 30s, anti-poverty activities in Montreal in the 40s, assisting her husband with the Shipyard Labour Organisation in 44, leading the Workers' Education Association in 45, opposing Canada's involvement in the Vietnam War. She is currently forming the Association in Defence of the Wrongly Convicted. She became involved with the support group in the wrongful imprisonment of Christine Lamont in Brazil. She has written books which are required reading for criminology courses in many of Canada's universities. Mrs. Culhane received the commemorative medal for the 25th anniversary of Canada's Confederation and is an honorary member of the British Columbia Humanist Association. So again, we're stand indebted to Claire Culhane. Can you stand one more?
Yes.
One of my favorites. You couldn't get a more charming woman than Pat Hutcheon. I first met Pat at a humanist discussion group in the mid-1980s at the Unitarian Church on Oak Street in Vancouver. About that time, there were two increasingly divergent streams of thought in that church. On the one hand, some members of the church were moving towards a more spiritual stance in their cosmic view. On the other hand, the BC Humanist Association had just been established. I was choking on some of the mildest words I've ever uttered. The BC Humanist Association had just been established and was proving to be an attractive source of fellowship for Pat and others like her, somewhat disillusioned with the spiritual trend in Unitarianism. Pat was born on a farm in Acadia Valley, Saskatchewan in 1927. Her mother was a devout and conservative Canadian Anglican whose energies were largely absorbed by raising a family of 9 during the Depression. Her father was somewhat of an intellectual and a free thinker from Iowa. He was a part-time farmer who also sold farm equipment throughout the prairies. Pat attributed her own agnostic views to the influence of her father and also to an episode in a church involving people speaking in tongues. She really couldn't understand what that was all about. I figured it had something to do with religion, and she didn't want anything to do with it. The family moved to a farm in Alberta where Pat attended a one-room school in a small village named Lonely Trail. And that subsequently became the title of her biography, Lonely Trail. While she loved the countryside and the farm work, life was pretty Spartan, what with the continuous shortage of money and food, plus severe weather. During this formative period, Pat encountered physical and sexual abuse, racism, and intolerance in about equal parts, and of course mostly covertly. To take just two examples, as a non-church person, she was not allowed to skate on ponds frozen for the children of Catholics. She was also denied a job she had been promised because her boss decided to give the job to a member of his own Anglican church. She also suffered a number of illnesses and injuries, but discovered the escapism offered by literature, music, curling, and movies, and began to understand the power of politics. The sudden death of her father through illness and of a young male friend during enemy action in World War II had a profound effect on her. With respect to education, she was a student of above average ability, but she dropped out of school at the end of grade 11 because of an administrative rule that required a certain number of hours. instruction in order to graduate from grade to grade. However, she later completed grade 12, winning the Governor General's Gold Medal and an IODE scholarship as the International Order of Daughters of the Empire scholarship. Her positive experiences with teaching in high school inclined her into the educational field. One of her employers even offered to pay her university tuition, but she declined and later got the scholarship which enabled her to go to Calgary Normal School. The Normal School, of course, for those who might not know, is where teachers were trained formally. It was also about this time that she decided that her mission in life would be for education and against injustice. She subsequently earned a B.Ed with a major in history from the University of Calgary, an M.A. in sociology and anthropology from the University of Calgary, and a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Queensland in Australia. She also headed the Educational Foundations Department at the University of Regina. Now, with respect to her career, in the spring of '46, with a teaching certificate in hand, Pat returned to the Lonely Trail one-room school to teach several grades of children. She next moved to Acadia Valley, Alberta, to teach grades 4, 5, and 6. About this time, she met and married Jack Westcott, a former military policeman, whom she married at age 21 in his Anglican church in the following year. It was not an ideal match, partly because Jack had serious psychological problems stemming from war service during the Blitz in London. Jack had very firm ideas about women's place in the world. I put women's place in quotes here in the manuscript. But also wanted Pat to quit teaching in order to take up farming. She refused and took up a teaching post in Big Prairie, Alberta. Among a number of confrontations with students and administrators there, she was once threatened by a student with a loaded shotgun. She managed to get the gun away from him. She experienced the most difficult pregnancy, although her son Tommy was safely delivered. Against Pat's better judgment, Jack insisted on having Tommy christened in the Anglican church. On the bright side, they did have some good harvests, so they had some money to spend and food to eat. In 1956, Pat was 30 years old. She began to realize that she needed a life plan, partly because changes in the public school system, changes at that time, because of the discovery of vast natural gas reserves in southern Alberta, partly because of Sputnik, the Soviet satellite, and there were a number of moves in the education field. Meanwhile, she continued to teach grades 7 and 8 in Acadia and enjoying the progress of her son Tommy, all the while having mounting concerns about the failing mental health of her husband. In the spring of 1960, she sold whatever she could to raise money to enable her to get a better teaching job in Calgary. She had to visit no less than 4 banks before one would give her a mortgage in her own name to buy a house. It was at this time she won a Canada Council Master Teaching Award, permitting to attend the University of Alberta full-time. So she went there for a year to complete the B.Ed degree, and that led, of course, to a better job at a bigger school teaching English and history. In 1964, she cashed in her teacher's pension to finance successful pursuit of a master's degree in sociology, despite being hospitalized at one point with leg pains while writing her 160-page thesis on educational change. This move opened up a whole new cadre of sympathetic friends and opportunities, and a coincidental introduction to the Unitarian Church and to other free thinkers. Shortly thereafter, Pat was awarded 2 fellowships, one to Stanford, one to Yale, plus an invitation to teach sociology as an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan in Regina. In 1965, she took the sociology job in Regina. This was a revolutionary time in Canadian education, what with the building of new universities, colleges, the influx of well-qualified, though mostly left-wing, even Marxist American professors escaping the Vietnam War. To some extent, as well as being influenced by her newfound intellectual colleagues through some active students, Pat's thinking was also affected by the Cultural Revolution occurring in China and by the blatant sexism she encountered in the university. It was also the start of the feminist revolution around that time. Towards the end of this period, Pat was becoming more in demand as a public speaker, fully occupied in developing new courses in education and learning at the university. She gave her first scholarly paper on the sociology of education. She was promoted to faculty status with tenure and also appointed to a number of committees concerning faculty tenure and promotions. In 1968, she decided on two major things. One was to take a leave of absence to accept the offer to go to Yale, which involved her first flight in a plane, by the way, and also to obtain a no-fault divorce decree from Jack Westcott. That was also the first decree of its kind issued in Alberta. Her first impressions of Yale were positive, as she did meet some remarkable people, made some very good friends, but these notions were quickly dispelled in the atmosphere of winners and losers which prevailed. Winners had influence, losers had scholarships. She was also surprised, that's what it said she was also surprised at the total lack of knowledge or interest in Canada. I'm not sure why she'd be surprised about that, because I think that's fairly widespread south of the border. She was also surprised at the total, but what disappointed her most was the blatant sexism and oppression of females that still occurred and prevailed throughout that institution. One particularly virulent episode with her doctoral thesis advisor caused her to quit the university altogether and return to Regina. Moving into the Unitarian phase, at this point, Pat again encountered members of the Unitarians whom she had first met in '65, including a man named Sandy Hutcheon. Sandy was a Scotsman, or had Scottish heritage, had recently been widowed, and his two sons were away from home, so he was pretty much on his own. He had completed grade 12 by correspondence and earned a degree in agriculture from the University of Saskatchewan. He was employed by the provincial government as an agricultural economist. He and Pat became engaged and were later married in New Haven after Pat had returned to Yale and before she left after that unfortunate episode. They had a brief honeymoon in New York City, but then she returned to Regina to teach a summer course. In the early 70s, Pat spent most of her time publishing thoughtful articles on education and sociology. And one winter evening, when she was driving home through ice and snow, a traffic policeman pulled her over and gave her a ticket. The ticket was for safe winter driving in difficult conditions. Amazing, isn't it? Around 1973, because of her experience, Pat was appointed to a provincial committee on education evaluation. She gave a keynote address to the Western District Unitarian Conference, in which she explained what the expression "God is dead" really meant. To the humanist, she said, it means that we can begin to direct our intelligence to human problems. She expounded on the shortcomings of multiculturalism and tribalism, two topics which became a central theme in later life. She also managed to fracture her pelvis when she slipped in some ice, which put her out of circulation for about 6 months. The operation to save her nearly killed her and troubled her for the rest of her life. Among other things, she had no tailbone, another odd genetic quirk, but that was part of the complication. However, she managed to use the time to finish the manuscript for a book, A Sociology of Canadian Education. She did it standing up, writing on top of the fridge, by the way. That's how she spent 6 months writing the book. Anyway, it became a classic, sold 1,200 copies in its first year. She eventually covered almost full mobility. And she and Sandy then both resigned their positions in Saskatchewan to go on an adventure to the University of Christchurch in New Zealand. However, it was not to be. At the last moment, the New Zealand government refused to issue the necessary visa because Sandy, at age 55, was too old to immigrate into New Zealand. And Pat, as a woman, couldn't sign the immigration forms. So it shows you how far we've come in the 30-odd years. I hope we've come as far in New Zealand. They immediately applied to immigrate to Australia, and both were accepted without reservation. Pat landed a position at the University of Brisbane, and Sandy secured work with the Queensland state government. Pat set to work on her PhD, proposing an interdisciplinary thesis for educational research. And for those of you who are interested, her thesis demonstrated Thomas Keynes' paradigm involving 4 factors of shared exemplars, human values, a model of reality, and an analysis of evidence. I'm sure you're all going to write that down and work on that. Not quite sure what it means. The Hutcheons observed that the Australian political system seemed to be a complicated amalgam of both the British and American systems, with one notable exception. Voting was compulsory. In Australia, you have to show up at the polling booth, and not to do so, $100 fine. They don't tell you how to vote, but you do have to show up at the polling station. Much of their spare time was spent exploring the areas around Brisbane, although they came in contact with the Humanist Association of Queensland. Pat presented a paper to that group titled The Failure of Humanism. She could present it to our group too, I guess, in which he stressed the need for more community efforts by free thought groups. It caused quite a stir locally and nationally in Australia. After a few false starts at trying to land an academic position in Australia, the Hutcheons decided to return to Canada after Pat received the job offer as an associate professor in education at the University of BC in '76. However, reminiscent of her early experience at losing a job to a more favoured applicant, it soon became apparent that history was repeating itself. Her position at UBC was to be temporary until a visiting American professor arrived to take over the position, when she would be let go. The dean appealed on her behalf because she was, first, well qualified, secondly, a Canadian citizen, thirdly, a female, but to no avail. She was asked to leave. For a number of political, philosophical, financial reasons, Pat decided it was time for early retirement. Now in retirement, her first activity was to assist Sandy with some of his projects. She also engaged in some home renovation, some extensive travel, re-established some family connections, took care of aging patients and so on. She reconnected with the Unitarian movement in Vancouver, which is when I first met her, in a variety of capacities, and through them became involved in settling some Vietnamese boat people in the city and finding jobs for them. Later, she was appointed BC Director of the Vanier Institute for the Family and initiated studies on daycare and nursery schools in BC, as well as the effects of violence in the media, in partnership with Al Cox, who's another of our BCHA members. Al's not here today. A large portion of the Hutcheons' later lives was spent in the company of our BCHA members, and also members of an outdoors hiking group. Like us, they met every week, and apart from trips up local mountains and over to the Vancouver Island, the hikers also went on walking tours in the UK. The Hutcheons moved from their house to a condo in Falls Creek. Sadly, Sandy's health declined, and he died after a series of strokes in 2001. One of Pat's last honours was the Distinguished Service Award of the American Humanist Association in 2001. One of her last projects was as one of the drafters of the new Humanist Manifesto 3 in the year 2003 by the American Humanist Association. She died in a hospice in Vancouver in 2010, surrounded by family. And I'd like to just close with, first of all, showing you some of the books and stuff that she'd written. And as you glance at that, you might take notes if you wish. I'd just like to recall a small personal incident which occurred in Winnipeg in the year 2000. Pat was invited to go to the Canadian Humanist Association's annual conference to receive the Humanist of the Year award for the year 2000. And it was held at the University of Manitoba. And during one of the sessions, which was held in a large lecture theatre, Pat was standing in the doorway of the lecture theatre talking to another author about a book which he had written called The Jesus Puzzle. It was Errol Doherty. And she had just written a book, The Road to Reason. So they were standing in the doorway, and when I showed up, and I'd just written a book called The Essence of Humanism, I couldn't get through the doorway. And so I said to them, "Is this what you would call a writer's block?" And to my astonishment, she included that little comment at the end of her life story. So I thought it was a fitting end to end on a light-hearted comment like that. Anyway, thank you very much.